Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for being here today, and welcome to our Safe Place to Land webinar. I'm Elizabeth Foster, Director of Philanthropy for the Nature Conservancy of South Carolina. I'm so happy to be your host today and to see you all here joining us. We're really excited to be partnering with our colleagues from the Latin America program at the Nature Conservancy, as well as with Open Space Institute. If you're like me, I know you'd rather be out in nature with your binoculars, but for now, this is a great and safe way for us all to connect. I'd like to thank our two sponsors who are trustees and great friends of the Nature Conservancy, Jessica Loring and Kay Grinnell. We are very appreciative for all they do for us and just appreciate their being sponsors for the webinar today. So let me just give you a brief overview of the program. We'll run about 45 minutes. Starting with the presentations from Dr. Mariah Whitehead and Dr. Tomas Walschburger, and then we'll have time for your questions. So to submit a question, you can just go to the bottom of the screen, click on the chat button, and type in your question. You can do that at any time during the presentation. We also recommend clicking on speaker view at the top right of your screen to see the video of the person who is actively speaking. And we'll keep everybody on mute just to avoid any background noise. So during the program, we're going to have a couple of questions or polls pop up that will help us to get to know you better and help us plan for our future webinars. So feel free to click to participate if you'd like, but it's not required. So we'll start with our first poll. We wanted to get an idea of where everybody's calling in from today, and we'll give it about 20 or 30 seconds. So the poll's going to pop up, and then just click your answer if you'd like, and we'll give it just a few seconds. Great. Thank you all so much for responding to that. It's great to see so many South Carolinians here on the call, but also quite a few from outside of South Carolina and looks like one from outside of the US. So thank you all for joining us today. And we'll move on to the program. And I'm very excited to introduce our presenters. First, we have Dr. Mariah Whitehead, who is a native of Florence, South Carolina, and during her career has worked as an ornithologist, professor, and conservation professional. I had the pleasure of working with Mariah here at the Nature Conservancy for several years, where her work focused on water funds, oyster restoration, and protecting wetlands, just to name a few of the items. Today, as Senior Program Manager at Open Space Institute, she works across the Eastern US on conservation projects, many of which include climate science. Our other presenter is Dr. Tomas Walschburger, and he has worked with the Nature Conservancy's Latin America program for over 15 years, providing science leadership in places like Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, Costa Rica, Panama, and Venezuela. Much of his work has been with stakeholders from the environmental and development sectors, such as oil and gas, coal, palm oil, and cattle ranching, to define priority conservation areas and to develop solutions for people and nature. And right here in South Carolina, we've been working from the mountains to the sea for over 50 years. And today our priorities are focused on protecting land and water, restoring forests, securing fresh water, and climate resilience and adaptation. And without the support of friends like you, this work would not be possible and would not have been possible for all these years. So Mariah and Tomas, thank you for being with us today. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Mariah, to get us started.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to start with my plug for getting your kids outdoors. This is actually a picture of me. I grew up on a rural farm in South Carolina outside of Florence with 3 brothers. And to say that my childhood was rough and tumble and spent outdoors might be an understatement. This is actually me at about 7 years old with a great horned owl that we raised. Please do not try this at home. I'm going to try to take the pass that it was the 1970s, that we don't know better. I went on later in my career to work for the Birds of Prey Center, and so I cannot encourage raising raptors on your own. But I think we all have a responsibility to get our kids out, to get our grandkids out, to take our nieces and nephews and neighbors' children. It's really important for the future of conservation and to have future scientists, for kids to establish a connection with the outdoors early. But we are here actually to talk about migration today. So I want to start with a little bit of a primer on migration. You know, migration is tied to the predictable seasonal opportunities for animals across the landscape. And for migratory birds, we often think of our migratory birds as maybe northern latitude birds that like to take a vacation in the winter and go down to the tropics. But what we actually know is that migration evolved the other way. Most of the migratory birds that we see in North America actually are tropical birds that evolved to move further and further north, looking for resources and an escape from the intense competition and predators that were in the tropics. And so what they found in our temperate forest were lower density of birds, ample resources, warm summers, and they took advantage of those. What we're looking at in this slide is actually not our migratory birds. It's another type of migration that ecologists think about. And that's the migration that we anticipate with climate change. And so linked to the migration of birds is the movement of habitats and how animals will need to adapt and move across the landscape to follow shifting habitats with climate change. So this map actually captures the average direction that mammals, birds, and amphibians are going to need to move to track hospitable habitats with a changing climate. The next thing I want to talk about is a really cool type of science that's helped us understand bird migration, and particularly nocturnal songbird migration. So back in the day, a couple of ornithologists at Louisiana State University developed a way to track bird migration. They focused a scope on the full moon and actually counted the silhouettes of birds that crossed in front of the full moon. Eventually, that evolved into the use of Doppler radar to study migrating birds and how they moved across the landscape. And this science was actually perfected by a Clemson ornithologist, Sid Gautreaux, who really perfected the use of this tool. And so what we can do now is we can use Doppler radar to filter out the weather, and we're left with the bird images. We can even distinguish the pattern and pace that the birds move to differentiate warblers from ducks and shorebirds. What we're seeing in this picture is a study that was conducted both in North Carolina, across the state, and along the eastern seaboard in the eastern US. And there's some scientists at the University of Delaware who perfected the use of radar and are able to couple that with land use types. And it helps us to understand the relationship between habitats and what migratory birds are depending on as stopover habitat on their migratory journey as they head south and as they return, heading north. And so what these radar studies have revealed to us is pretty fascinating and very useful if you're in the business of land conservation. Radar images have shown a really tight relationship between coastal floodplain forests, so our beautiful riverine forests like the Black River floodplain that we see in this photograph as being extremely important for migratory birds, even for those birds that we don't normally associate with this forest type. What they found on the northbound migration is that actually birds start to depend more on our southern Appalachian forest. And so we saw a higher density of birds using the forests and the hardwoods and in the southern Alps on their return to the US. I want to talk about some of the threats to birds and to migrating birds. The primary threat to migrating birds, and this was reinforced with the radar studies, is habitat loss. We know that habitat loss and degradation is the #1 threat to most animal species, but we particularly see this with migratory birds. And another threat we would call habitat fragmentation. So habitat fragmentation often brings in more predators, brood parasites that trouble our breeding birds, and it can exclude forest birds that depend on interior forest habitat. But it's important to note when we think about habitat fragmentation that this does not mean all disruption of the forest is actually bad for birds. What I learned in my PhD research in the Southern Alps is that our birds actually depend on forest openings in the right context. So forest disturbance and sustainable forestry practices can actually be really important for sustaining our bird populations, and particularly our migratory bird populations. One of the things I saw in my research was that in these small forest openings that might be equivalent to a single tree fall or a wind blow down from when a hurricane made its way up to the mountains, is that those openings were just loaded with resources, both fruit and insects, and that all types of birds loaded into those types of habitats to fuel their journey along the way. And this is an important part of our work as conservationists. It's one thing to protect habitat, and then it's an ongoing responsibility to steward them and to think about the quality of that habitat that we're offering migratory birds and other species. Another threat that we think a lot about now is habitat shifts with climate change. And so in this picture, we're actually looking at what used to be a freshwater forested wetland that's transitioned to brackish marsh or perhaps salt marsh already, along a salinity gradient with climate change and sea level rise. But we have similar gradients and transitions that are happening along elevation gradients as we move upslope, along latitudinal gradients as weather warms. And this has profound influence on bird habitat, particularly birds that return to the same place over and over and depend on having resources there for breeding and fueling their journey or in their wintering habitat. So one of the things that TNC scientists and other scientists have coined is a phrase that we call protect the stage, but not the actors. And that concept is that if we protect enough contiguous natural habitat, that habitats will have room to flex and change over time with climate change. And that's going to allow our migratory birds and other species to persist. When we think about protecting the stage for a migratory species that travels 2,500 miles, that's a big job. And it's why we need to have partners in South America doing this work as well. So I'm going to talk about a couple of my favorite birds. We'll start with the journey of the cerulean warbler. The cerulean is a beautiful songbird that we find in our southern Appalachian mountains, and you might even find one right at the edge of the South Carolina-North Carolina line. Ceruleans used to be one of our most common birds in eastern forests, but they're a bird that depends on old growth habitat. They need larger diameter trees and complex habitat. And when we cut most of our hardwoods across the east at the early 1900s to 1950, we saw just a precipitous decline of this species. And the bird has now had a severe range restriction, and we find them just in a few locations, sort of dotted across their former range. And one of those places is the Southern Alps. So ceruleans take on that journey like so many of our migratory birds in North America, or neotropical migratory birds, leaving perhaps its breeding area on Caesar's Head in South Carolina and moving down through the Gulf states, across Central America to its wintering grounds in South America, and Colombia being one of those places. And what we know about what they need when they reach the other end of that journey is that they do prefer primary forests, that more old growth forests, but they can also use other forests like shade-grown coffee, and we'll hear more about that from Timon. So what are we doing to protect ceruleans in South Carolina and North Carolina? You know, we have incredible work underway, and our forest matrix of the Southern Alps is one of the most impressive and intact in all of the East. But we know that the quality of the habitat is what's most important for ceruleans. So we have PNC scientists and others that are teaming up with our major landowners, with the Forest Service, with state owners, and thinking about how to improve quality of habitat of already protected land. We have our managers that are out there returning forest fire to the mountains, which has been suppressed from fire for decades. And so really thinking about quality of habitat, even on those places that are already protected. And now I'm going to talk about my favorite bird, the swallowtail kite. This is a bird that I've worked with for over 2 decades, working on research and conservation of this incredible social raptor, a favorite of many birders. And swallowtail kites use the coastal plain of South Carolina, really all the way to the North Carolina line. We now have our first ever breeding records in North Carolina. They'll nest in the forest floodplains of the rivers, like those that we see are so important for our fall migrants, often picking a super emergent pine tree that sticks up above the rest of the canopy for easy entry into their nest. And these guys are so unique because they really are social at every stage in their annual cycle. Kites actually nest in loose colonies. 3 or 4 pairs will nest close together and help each other defend their nest. They forage communally, and they'll roost together as well. And what we see here is actually a foraging aggregation of about 100 kites feeding over a pasture in Allendale, South Carolina. These guys are taking advantage of an eruption of June bugs, probably. They feed on insects and capture insects in the air and bring their feet to their mouth and forage on the wing. And so what we see with kites is they actually need a real array of habitats to meet their energetic needs and their breeding needs in South Carolina. So what have we done for kites in coastal South Carolina? Well, coastal South Carolina's conservation success story is incredible. We have over 1.3 million acres of land protected across the coast. It represents just the diverse array of habitat types that kites need, everything from the intact forested wetlands to open habitats that they use to forage. This picture is actually of a property along the Black River, 600-acre tract with beautiful old growth cypress, a known night nesting site for swallowtail kites that is protected with a PNC easement. This picture shows sort of the distribution of protected lands across coastal South Carolina. So South Carolina's turned on its side in this picture. If you can imagine moving from north to south, we see sort of those areas where we have strongholds of protection. The Petey River Basin, the Francis Marion National Forest, the Ace Basin with all the privately protected lands, as well as the Savannah River. We see the importance of partnerships in this picture, the dark green being federally protected lands, the brown state protected lands, and yellow represent our privately protected lands and conservation easements. What we know from studying swallowtail kites is these strongholds for conservation are also our strongholds for swallowtail kites in South Carolina. And we've learned just a tremendous amount about how kites move across the landscape. This picture on the left is of a researcher, Gina Kent, who I've known for a couple of decades, climbing an 80-foot pine tree to retrieve 2 kite nestlings that are then fitted with satellite transmitter backpacks that allow us to follow this bird through its movements across the globe. The picture on the top right is actually one of me from about 20 years ago, fitting a kite with what was the best technology at the time, a radio transmitter backpack. So once these kites have been fitted with these transmitters, we can actually follow them for years sometimes. You focus in on the yellow bird that you can see, the yellow track crossing the globe. That's a bird that was placed with a backpack in South Carolina. And this shows that bird's northbound migration from Western Brazil up through South America, through Colombia, Central America, as it hops off the Yucatan Peninsula and then goes right back to that same nest tree in South Carolina. In a minute, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Tomas, but we're going to do a quick poll now. We've got a quiz for you guys on migratory birds and how they do it.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Thomas Walschburger. I live in Bogota, Colombia, and I'm the senior science advisor for the NASCA program, which covers Ecuador, Colombia, and Central America, Panama, Costa Rica. First slide you saw, it's when I was like a small kid also in Colombia, and I grew up in Colombia. My father was an engineer, and so I had opportunity to learn a lot of Colombia, so I get very well acquainted of the nature of Colombia. And then I studied biology, and I worked a lot of time also in the Amazon. And when I started in TNC 15 years ago, I have been working in many places now around South America, but mostly in Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. And I am not an ornithologist, but I have been working with birds, and I obviously am a bird watcher and like birds very much. So what I wanted to show you is that there are many different routes of migratory birds to South America, as already Mariah mentioned. There's one along the East Coast, along the Mississippi River, along the central part of the United States on the West Coast. And many of all these birds come to Colombia. There are more than 275 species of migratory birds coming to Colombia, and not all come from North America, but around 154 come from the northern part to South America and Colombia, and there are also some birds coming from the south from Argentina and Uruguay and southern Brazil to Colombia. So Colombia is an interesting country because it's the country with the highest diversity of birds in the world. Now we have more than 1,955 birds in Colombia, and the list is growing now because they still find new bird species in Colombia now because it's a very complex country and a lot of mountains and rivers and deserts and very humid rainforests. So it's a very diverse country. As I already mentioned, there are also a lot of birds migrating from the south. This beautiful bird, the fork-tailed flycatcher, migrates from the pampas of Argentina and southern Brazil here to Colombia, to the llanos, which is also a grassland area, unique in the tropical area. Next. Already Mariah talked about these 2 species, which are tropical migrants, the cerulean warbler and the swell-tailed kite. So this is Colombia, the map of Colombia, and it shows all the places where it comes to Colombia, And the darker the spot you see, the more visitors we have from the north. And this species, for example, the cerulean warbler, was a species which lived in the Andean forest, in the Andean mountains of Colombia. Many of these habitats has been also lost because of deforestation, but this cerulean warbler is very interesting because he adapted very well to live in shade coffee. So, for example, we lost the native forests, but now they adapted also to these shade coffee growing areas. The swallow-tailed kite is also, you see, it comes to much more areas different to the cerulean one. It's in the mountains, but also in the valleys of the Magdalena River, in the Amazon. So it's much more widespread, so it has much more possibilities, to come and make stopovers in Colombia. Cerulean warbler stays, also for a long time during the winter here in the northern part here in Colombia. So he's a permanent habitat during the winter of the US. Next one. That there are migrations. So we have migrations from during the spring, that we see that the species move from the south also to the north in the United States, because when we lose the cold climate very north, in the northern part, a lot of species moving to the north, but the highest diversity is where the green spot is. This shows, the index shows only how many species we are, in relatively compared to other species we have. So this is an analysis of 109 different migratory species and how they behave during the whole year. So you see when they breed, they move they breed in the northern part, and you see that there is a migration during the breeding session, maybe in April, June. And finally, when the cold starts, there is a migration in September, October, where many of all these species are moving to the south. So you see that there is a migration mostly to Central America, but a lot of species come also to Colombia, and some go even more south, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, and also to the northern part of Argentina and Brazil. And mostly all of these species are non-breeding species. They come only here and stay during the cold winter here in South America. Next one. So what is happening? As I already mentioned, we are losing a lot of habitats in all these South American countries, because mostly also by immigrants, there was a lot of forest loss, but still there is a lot of deforestation in Colombia happening mostly in some areas of the Amazon, but also in the Andean part. So you see, for example, this is a forest area in the Andean part of Colombia, and you see that there's a lot of areas being deforested, mostly for cattle ranching, because that's the easiest way. You cut down the trees and you have to put in some cows, and that's the easiest and the most secure type of agricultural use you can have for the land. Other types are more difficult to sell and everything. So there are a lot of different migrating species I already mentioned. And you see that many of all these grasslands and pasture land is degraded, and that's a huge problem. If you lose all the forest and the trees, obviously all these migratory birds have no opportunities on where to land and where to feed in Colombia and other countries. Next one. So this is some maps that show what may happen in the future. I think this is made on seeing what has been the historical trend of deforestation in many of all these Andean countries, like Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Argentina. You see that there is still a expectation that there may be a lot of habitat loss, mostly on the Pacific coast of Colombia and in Panama, and also in Costa Rica. But you see also in the US, there's still some threats that we may lose some of the native forests in these countries. And not so much for agriculture. It's mostly, I think, for cattle ranch. And you see that here in South America, Colombia, well, we still hope that these deforestation rates go down, and it's really going down. There is now a new policy and really trying to stop all these deforestation processes in Colombia also. Next one. So what is happening? Many of all these species that are coming to Colombia, when they come, there are a lot of areas. You see all these spots here, brown and green. These are all the places where all these migratory birds land in Central America and also in the northern part of Colombia. So you see that some of these spots are green. That says that these areas where they come to Colombia, they are already protected. But a lot of all these areas are not protected, and so in a certain sense, these habitats have to be secured. And there's still an effort in creating new protected areas. Colombia is a country with a lot of protected areas. I think more than 1/3 of Colombia, 20% of Colombia is already protected, so it has a lot of protected areas. But obviously we cannot protect all these important areas. And so we have to find different strategies on how to secure these habitats for all these species. Next one. So, for example, this is also another example of a migratory bird which has very, very specific habitat requirements. Now, this is Colombia. These are the 3 mountain ranges in Colombia, the central Cordillera, the eastern and the western. And so there is a forest, an Andean forest, which was also deforested, and sometimes to create shade coffee areas. And this migratory bird depends completely on this type of habitat. And so some of these habitats, as I mentioned, are protected and other none, but many of these species, like the cerulean warbler and other warblers, are also adapting themselves to live in these shade coffee areas in the Andean region. Next one. So we have obviously an opportunity and to see how we produce food, because obviously Colombia is still a land with a lot of poverty, and many of the people is still searching for new land, and so they deforest because of that. So what we're trying is to, for example, to maintain shade coffee. Shade coffee maintains a lot of trees, as you see. There's plantain and other species also grown within these plantations. So there's a lot of food available also for birds, insects, everything, and other trees. This is cocoa, which is also, it is originally from the Amazon, but you can also grow it in shade areas. And what we are working very lot is because Colombia has a lot of area in cattle ranching. There are more than 60 million acres in cattle ranching, and the idea is to restore many of these degraded cattle ranching areas to silvopastoral systems. Is where we plant trees again into these grasslands. So there's these trees help to recover the soil, and so they recover the biodiversity in these degraded lands. Next one. So what we see is that in the future, obviously we cannot protect everything. So we have to have the two strategies. We have to spare land for conservation. It's all these green areas. You see here in Brazil, in Colombia, there is mostly a lot of national parks in the Amazon, also in the grasslands of the Orinoco and in the Andean region. But for example, in the US, you see also there are some protected areas, much more in Canada. But these more purple areas is habitats where we have native forest patches, riparian or riverine forests, and we have area agriculture. So it's like a mosaic, you know. In this mosaic, there can be also a lot of species. There may be a lot of species surviving and living there, and they can maintain in these habitats. So this, I think, is we have to work with these two strategies, not to protect, but also to share the land with conservation and production. No? Next one. So this is, for example, work we have been doing in Colombia and now in different parts of Colombia. In the northern part of Colombia, where it's more dry forest, in the grasslands, and in the Andean part, where we're trying to recover all these lands that have been transformed to grasslands and transform it again to more the silvopastoral systems, where you see there are a lot of trees and also grasslands, so you have much more food. It can be something like 5 times more food in a silvopastoral system, like compared to an open grassland. So, for example, this is also a very good habitat for the swallow-tailed kite. We already mentioned. He likes all these riparian habitats. So we are also improving the habitat for many of all these migratory birds. And it's not only a program to recover habitat for birds and biodiversity, but also the benefits for people are incredibly high now, because the productivity may be 2 or 3 times higher than the cattle ranching in open grassland areas. Next one. So this is for example, what we have been also measuring in all these silvopastoral systems in Colombia. So we registered more than already 479 bird species in all these silvopastoral systems. If they're in Colombia, something like 2,000 species, 1/4 of these species has the possibility to live also in the silvopastoral systems. We monitored also dung beetles, and there were 98 dung beetle species living in this. So these species are very important because they renew the soil. They bring all these, the cattle, the manure from the cattle is reincorporated into the soil, and so they maintain the functionality of all these systems. So this is an incredible strategy to recover all these lands. Next one. So what are we trying to do with this sustainable cattle ranching is we have impacted something like 500,000 acres in Colombia with the silvopastoral systems, but we want to scale this up obviously to maybe 10 million acres or even more. And so obviously the idea would be to transform around 25 million acres in the next 10 years. And so that we can really have these incredible results in improving biodiversity, environmental services, habitat for a lot of species, native species, migratory birds, everything. And so it's also an incredible strategy to connect national parks. Also, because if a national park is an island and you connect it with other ones through the riparian forests or other areas, so if the landscape is very well connected, as the mosaics I mentioned, we can maintain all this incredible biodiversity, not only in Colombia, but in all these countries and also in the US. Next one. So I think we can make also a very short poll to all of you, to see if you have been sometime in Colombia, and if you have been or not been. Well, a lot of visitors have been to Colombia, and obviously you're all invited to come here and to see all the work we're doing here. And if you want to come to Colombia, obviously you can come in contact with us, and we would obviously give you all the support not to travel through Colombia.
Thank you, Tomas and Mariah. We really appreciate all your wonderful information and It's just been great to have you both here. I think we'd all agree that migratory birds are such a great example of why local to global conservation is so important, and that is something that the Nature Conservancy is expert at. Even if we do everything here in South Carolina we possibly can to protect their habitat, it's not enough for them to thrive. They need places to stop and rest and a safe place to land. So I hope that today has given you a little more information about that. We're going to take a couple of questions. I know we're about to run out of time, but we're going to go over a few minutes just to have a couple of questions. If you have them, type them into the chat. We'll get to as many as we can. We'll also give you an opportunity to email if you don't get your question answered today on the webinar. We have a couple that were submitted in advance as well. So I will start with our first question. I think this one is for Mariah. We had someone who said they see a lot of kite activity on freshly mowed meadowland, but they don't see the same activity on golf courses and other frequently mowed land. So are all grasslands created equal, and what do these birds really need to thrive? Mariah, turning that over to you.
Thanks. That's a great question. You know, what we see when the kites are foraging in aggregate over open habitat is they're looking for sizable insect eruptions usually. They're looking for those habitats where we just see a great density of beetles or dragonflies, and golf courses are not always that. You know, the management of golf courses, pesticides used are really going to limit them as a resource, but the open habitats where we see lots of insects are hay fields, fallow fields, rice fields, and freshwater marsh, and that's where you can often see a concentration of kites.
Thanks. Here's another question. I think this is also from Mariah. Someone asked how they can get involved in local efforts to help migratory birds and bird habitat.
Well, and since we have a lot of our folks from South Carolina, I will say, you know, I mentioned the use of radars for tracking migratory birds, but we have been really successful in using citizen science as a resource for tracking migratory birds. More and more, I think scientists are relying on report systems like eBird to actually understand bird distribution and movement, habitat associations, and there's a really fun opportunity in tracking hawk migration. So we actually in South Carolina have several hawk watch stations, including one in Awendaw run by the Birds of Prey Center, where you can get trained to go watch raptors and become part of a huge network, an array of sites that are tracking raptor migration across the U.S.
Great. Here's a question. I think this one is for Tomas. Is ecotourism contemplated as an additional funding mechanism for the shade-grown coffee plantations and cattle plantations that attract birds?
Yes, good question. No, yes, I think what we're trying to do is to diversify the production systems in Colombia. If people only rely on cattle, but if they plant also other trees, and these trees can be used for fruit or also for wood maybe in the future. And if the biodiversity is increased in all these shade coffee areas and cocoa areas, obviously ecotourism can be an excellent alternative, and there is people like to come also to see the coffee farms which are very beautiful, and if you can see birds, and so this is a very new industry, and as Colombia is a much safer country now, the ecotourism is improving very, very rapidly, and mostly bird watching. There are a lot of bird watching opportunities in Colombia, and as you can see, more than 1,900 species. I think it's one of the best areas where you can go to bird watch in the world.
And Tomas, the person goes on to ask, who controls the 24 million acres you mentioned in Colombia?
We have the national park systems that protects the national parks, but we have also regional parks. So there are regional environmental authorities. That's also incredible. Now there is the private protected area, and also you can inscribe your farm. If you have something not to protect in your farm, you can include it in the protected area system, and so you receive also some benefits. So that very, very different mechanisms of protecting land. And for example, these private areas where we are also working, trying to transform all these original degraded lands to recover that to silvopastoral systems or to cocoa land, so that there are more than maybe, I think more than 1 million acres already protected in private lands also in Colombia. And also that's increasing very, very fast.
Thank you. Okay, here's another question. Could you please explain how farmers and ranchers can be encouraged to help wildlife? How is doing so a benefit to farmers and ranchers?
I think farmers and ranchers, they obviously see that if they transform their original, the open pasture lands to silvopastoral systems where the trees and all the diversity are already, so the productivity increases, and also they have a much higher income. And as Mariah also mentioned, if people really see the importance, that these birds are controlling insects, and so that the biodiversity is really helping to maintain their agricultural system, so they have to buy much less agrochemicals, and biodiversity is really doing all these environmental services. They're renewing the soil, these dung beetles I mentioned, the insects eating, the pollination, for example, in coffee areas, by hummingbirds, not specifically the coffee, but other species there. And also all this biodiversity is really helping and reducing the cost of production, and that is incredible, because you have a win-win situation, and people, and if there's ecotourism, they also can profit from taking people to their coffee plantations or to the silvopastoral systems. And so it's really helping to create a real consciousness around the importance of biodiversity, and more in these scenarios of climate change, where the silvopastoral systems and the shade cover areas are much more resistant, resilient to any changes. So they will also be much better adapted to changes in climate.
Thank you. Tomas, I think this one's for you too. Why do birds leave such a naturally rich country as Colombia to go on such an arduous migration to North America? Couldn't they breed and find sufficient food in Colombia?
I think, yes, Mariah tried to explain that, and obviously there's a lot of competition in Colombia, because obviously if there are 2,000 bird species and they're competing for food and everything, and they're losing habitat, yes, migration, competition is here very high. And what they are doing is that, as many of these species originated here in the tropics, and they find new habitats in the northern part, and so they escape in a certain way, the competition, the harsh competition they have here in the tropical area, and so it's a strategy also to surviving. And as you know, there was also during all these ice ages, many of the species that lived in the northern and the southern part, they were covered by ice, so they had to they came obviously and had to survive in the tropical areas, in the subtropical areas, and then they recovered all these areas when something like 20,000 years ago, the ice age went away, so they recovered all these habitats. So I think it's very interesting how, because all these habitats have been shifting all the time, and these species adapt and move and diversify very rapidly, and so that's a good strategy to maintain themselves in these types of countries. But obviously I think competition is harsher here.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. This one's for Mariah. Has the swallowtail kite population stabilized?
You know, that's a great question. I think the general consensus is that the North American population of swallowtail kites has slightly increased in more recent decades. When we lost almost all of that bottomland hardwood forest system, that same sort of, you know, all at once harvesting that I talked about that happened in the early 1900s that affected cerulean warblers, that was also a severe range restriction for swallowtail kites. And we're starting to see kites reclaiming some of their former breeding areas with regrowth of forest and that forest moving into an older age class. And the interesting thing about that question is we don't have a definitive population estimate for swallowtail kites. I got to be part of a really cool study where we did simultaneous counts of roosting kites during pre-migration, where 5 of us were up in fixed-wing aircraft flying riverine areas and counting heads of kites. And so we came up with the best yet population estimate at that time, which would likely warrant the federal listing of swallowtail kites as a threatened species. But we do not yet have a definitive number. Well, that was kind of a long answer.
Thank you. We're going to have one final poll in just a second, but I just want to take a moment to thank you all for joining us today. I hope that we can count on your support of the Nature Conservancy to continue this great work that we're doing. Thank you again to our sponsors, Jessica Loring and Kate Grinnell. I did want to tell you about a wonderful matching gift opportunity available to all new and increased donors up to $1,000 to the Nature Conservancy, that their gifts will be matched 1-to-1 until the end of August. So we would love for you to take advantage of that support opportunity to make your gift count even more. We will be sending a follow-up email with that information, and we will also give you the opportunity to email in questions if you didn't get yours answered today. So we have one last poll that is going to ask what you would like to see in future webinars, and we will take that into consideration as we continue our planning. Thank you so much. I hope next time we see you, we'll be out in nature, but if not, join us for our next webinar. We really appreciate your support. Thank you.